Welcome to the Global WeSpace Summit, a first-of-its-kind online journey into collective consciousness and practice. For this event, over 150 trailblazing pioneers and WeSpace experts from North America and Europe have been invited to share their latest insights and reflections on this subject. Bringing our best discernment inside these conversations, the many approaches of each WeSpace lineage come to life. As we explore pathways into the collective development and transformation of our lives and culture at this time, we are delighted to have you join us on this journey. Welcome everyone to the WeSpace Summit. I'm your host, Pare, and I am here with Cynthia Bampton. And when I say here, it's in this virtual space that we're allowed through technology because I'm calling from Montreal and Cynthia is in Portugal. She's originally from California, and with her husband, Pete Bampton, who's from Great Britain, they found this promised land in central Portugal. It was a gorgeous space, which still is gorgeous, and that they found to be full of potential for what they were dreaming into manifestation, which is a beautiful project called the Awakened Life Project. And first, you'd like to say more about that, Cynthia, to start with?
Okay, thanks, Anne. Yeah, we started the Awakened Life Project about 10 years ago, and it is in a beautiful place in the central mountains of Portugal. And the whole vision behind the place is to really be able to live the truth of unity in relationship with other people, but also in nature. And so the project is here in central Portugal, but really the project has expanded beyond this physical place. So there's lots of people who are living in the city, in Lisbon, and in different countries throughout Europe, and some people in the States, even in South America. And it's just an ever-expanding network of people who are completely interested in trying to live the truth that we actually are all one consciousness. And so that's really what the project is about, and it's an it's a never-ending exploration, and it's an organic process. It doesn't seem to have an end. It's very much about the evolution of the individual, but also the evolution of the collective. So we just finished a 10-day retreat here, so we're all completely quite inspired, I have to say, quite inspired by the we space that actually opened up on this retreat. So it's a living, breathing expression of what we've been doing for 10 years.
Mm. And what you've been doing, it's very diversified. There are many projects happening within the big project, and it's an integral project. It's a sustainable project. It has permaculture. It's a real living the we in the spiritual ways, in the daily life. How does that, is it a daily we? How does that feel?
The daily we, I like that. It's interesting because we don't split things up between spiritual life and daily life. And that's kind of a common thing that people do. They have their spiritual life and then they try to fit it into their daily life, or they take their daily life and they try to fit it into their spiritual life. So really what we consider to be we space, and it's not a word that I always use, but it's definitely what we do. But the basis of the project here, the practice that we do, is meditation. And the meditation is where we can actually go to a deeper dimension of ourselves, or the deepest dimension of ourselves, that actually shows that there is only one consciousness that's shining through my eyes, and one consciousness that's shining through your eyes. In fact, that one consciousness that's animating everything that we see, everything that we perceive, everything in this manifest world. So a lot of the time we impose separation on that unified consciousness that's manifesting through the many forms. So really the we space, from my understanding and the way that we work with it, is to really start to understand that movement of separation, that movement of limitation, to understand that from the point of view of this deeper dimension that is always already free, that's always already unified. So it's kind of two-phased. It's one, to rest in the true nature of all beings as ourselves. And it's also be able to manifest that, which means that we have to understand this movement of ego, you could say, that's trying to block that free expression. So when there's a group of people coming together, interested in manifesting this deeper dimension that's beyond all of these ideas about separation, all of these ideas about limitation, then what happens is we become conscious of that unified field, which you could call we space. But it's not something we create as individuals. It's something that's always already there, that we actually allow ourselves to participate in. So sometimes people think you're trying to create this particular space, and that's not it. What it is trying, actually not even trying, just really surrendering to that which is already there, that which I already am, and then to engage with others in that same way. So it's very demanding. It's not just like having an experience. It's actually a way of being. It's resting in who we actually already are and being willing to open our mouths else other than our ideas that are only coming from our minds. And then something starts to happen. And that's where it gets very exciting.
And now, because you're many living there, I guess there's part of the community that lives with you in a permanent way, more or less. And there are visitors, there are people who come for the retreats. So there are different, gears, paces, amounts of layers. How do you integrate all of this?
Well, that's the interesting thing, is because in a certain way, if we're all actually the deepest dimension of ourselves is that one consciousness, there's not anything we need to integrate. There's just something that we need to surrender to. So of course, if somebody's new, they might not be resting so deeply, or they might not even understand what we're talking about right now. But usually when people come here, they do know what we're about. They do know that we're somewhat of an ashram here at the project, which is Quinta de Miserella, where the physical place is. We do consider ourselves an ashram, so people know when they come here that it is about spiritual practice. It is about an emergence of something new. So they have some idea, but really what we find, and this is the amazing thing, is that if anybody is interested, just giving themselves and being open, available, interested, then they're already part of the whole thing that's going on. They might have less of an intellectual understanding, but that doesn't really matter. It really only has to do with the curiosity and the interest. And then they're in. I mean, this last retreat we did, we probably only had 3 or 4 people that are part of our community participating in the retreat, and the rest were brand new people. And it was the deepest retreat we've ever had. It was the most explosive retreat that had a collective emergence that continued and continued and continued, and people were falling more, deeper and deeper into this, and being able to relate to each other beyond ideas about themselves, about anybody else, but be able to relate to each other beyond gender, just being together. And at the same time, understanding they have all sorts of thoughts going on, they have all sorts of ideas still going on in their head, but they're just not making them important. And then they allow themselves to rest in this field that's just waiting for anybody that wants to join, really. So it's available to anybody, and there's certain things that you can do to help facilitate people to relax into what's already there, but we're definitely not creating something. We're just being willing participants to of what is already calling and already wants to be lived.
It's beautiful how you connect openness and relaxation, like relaxing into openness, and how that, from what I hear from you, sounds to be the only thing needed, really. Then the rest starts unfolding.
Yeah, I mean, it's openness and availability, but that also takes, commitment. It takes intention, because, everyone needs to be able to have a different relationship a different relationship to their thoughts, to their emotional experience, because most of the time we're turned inward and our whole focus is on what's going on in our head or what's going on in the sensations of our body. And we're very fascinated with all that. So if you have a group of people that are just walking around completely fascinated with their own thoughts and their own emotions, then they're pretty much cut off from from this field that I'm talking about. So really, it does take the individual effort to say, well, look, I'm just not really that excited about my internal experience. I want to see something different than what I normally see. So just turn your attention away from those things. It's not denying that there's thoughts and feelings arising, but just not being so fascinated with them as if they're the most important things in the world, just letting them kind of fade to the background, and just becoming aware of, oh my God, when I'm not focused on myself, on this separate self that seems to be who I am, when I don't focus on that, it's like a whole world appears. All new possibilities appear. And I think it's always a surprise because it's always new. So even those of us who have been around for a while, it's never old. It's always new. It's ever new, ever new, ever new. And so that's why when there's a group of people who are willing to take their attention off the separate self and put it outward, when there's a group of people willing to do that, we're always surprised at where we can go together and what we can do, and just surprised at the joy. Sometimes you just have to bear the joy of being together.
I would love
because we're so used to doing stuff. We're so used to like spending all our time trying to get over ourselves, But when you take away, there's nothing to get over, then you kind of go, well, what am I going to do with all my time? And then you might just sit there with, kind of a silly smile on your face, or you might end up dialoguing about things that you'd never thought about before. Like what is real freedom, or what is the relationship to that which I cannot grasp? How do I live with you? How do we communicate? Is there a new way to communicate? So you can talk about all sorts of stuff that one usually doesn't even think about. And you know what else? I just want to add this one thing that's really beautiful about new people, because new people will come in with the most interesting questions, like the most basic, simple, interesting questions. And, it's those simple questions that are the most, they bring forward something, because there's so many things that we think we already know, and we assume we already know something, and somebody will just ask a simple question. I wish I could have an example right now. But just a simple question like, well, what is victimization? What actually is it? Instead of just assuming that you know what it is. And then you go into it.
And it updates it in a way. Oh, Cynthia, I think we lost you.
Well, it brings it alive. Yeah, I'm here. I can see you.
Yeah, there was a shortcut.
Oh, okay. But nope, I'm still here.
I would love to hear from your last retreat. Because it was very recent, and what came up? What was any newness or freshness that you would like to share from this time around?
Gosh, it wasn't really one particular thing. Well, I can say this, because what we did is we started off with 5 days of meditation. And we meditated for, I think it was about, 7 or 8 hours a day. And And then we would have a question answer session in the evening. And it seemed like those question answer sessions would go deep. The 5 days, we started to engage and to speak. We did different exercises. We did eye gazing together 4 days in a row. And that was beautiful because every day when you gazed into someone else's eyes, there was something different that you were looking at than you had the day before. You were having a different experience of that which was actually the same that you were looking at. But there was one particular night, I think it was like on day 6 or 7. And so I think it was after we had discussion groups, and the discussion groups were, we call them awakened communication. And they started off within groups of 8, and then we had groups of 16, and then we had the whole retreat, which the whole retreat was 34 people. But there was one particular night, and I think it was after the first discussion groups, that the people who were normally quite quiet were just exploding. And it was literally like we did a presentation about the creative impulse, and we just talked about giving yourself to the creative impulse. And I don't know what happened on this night, but it was just like these sparks were flying out of individuals' mouths, and people were just, they couldn't wait to talk, and they couldn't wait to express themselves, and each expression was new and unique, and each expression was also seeing that individual in a way that we hadn't seen before. And so not only were the individuals not just an energy in the room, but it was literally like we were individual expressions, but it was creating a one greater expression. And everybody was aware of this as it was happening. You know, we were making it conscious. And the more we made it conscious, just the higher we went together. And what came out was not only interesting content, but what came out of it was just this incredible, I mean, beyond anything I'd ever experienced, this incredible lightness of being, an absolute joy. And it wasn't the joy of Cynthia being alive. It was the joy really of the one consciousness seeing itself through the individuals. It was literally like we were just in love with our expression of that one self through the many. And, you know, none of us slept that night. We were so awake and so alert. It was like, we talked about it the next day. So many people couldn't even get to sleep, but a lot of us experienced where we were completely awake and we weren't even sure if we were sleeping or not. We kind of knew the body was resting. We knew the body, sort of sleeping, but at the same time, you know, we were so alert. And consciousness itself never sleeps. So when you start to rest more deeply into consciousness as yourself, you understand that actually at your deepest dimension, you don't sleep. Consciousness doesn't sleep. The body sleeps. So it's like, it's a way of being awake to the fact that you're consciousness and being aware that the body is sleeping. So it was, and that just continued, you know, but I think that was the one moment that things started to really, really make itself known. And the interesting thing is both Pete and I, when we started to lead this retreat, because we've been doing this for a long time, and the intentions of this group, we asked people to bring their intentions and to put it on a piece of paper, and they could do artistically represent it. But we both felt this demand from something, and it was a demand that a collective emergence was going to happen, and our job really was just to try to facilitate it. But my experience was the demand was really just don't mess it up. Just, you know, keep everything on track, keep giving everything. So we ended up we just had to surrender in the same way that all the participants were surrendering. So we were in it together in a really incredibly beautiful way.
Thank you. And I can feel how in those moments there is something usually starts happening of something has to be done about it. Like, oh, there's all this creativity bubbling up, and then there's an urge that is really more of the mind or of movement of ego that is like, oh, can't let that go, can't let it be wasted. Now something has to be done about it. And how do you work with that urge when so much bubbliness, busyness, creativity is coming up?
Well, the thing is very interesting. I'll just speak from my experience because I know what you're talking about. You know, when people have individual spiritual experiences sometimes, you know, the tendency is to want to grasp it, to do something with it, to hold on to it, to have it again. But what part of what we teach is that what I'm talking about is not an experience. So freedom is not an experience. Freedom is our natural state. And so, you know, just to use this retreat as an example, we also were speaking a lot about the movement of ego and this movement to want to grasp. So people were aware of this. And the situation for this particular retreat was that people were resting so deeply that that urge to grasp either wasn't there at all or it was seen. And the thing that kind of surprised me, because what you're saying usually, you know, can happen, but people were so aware that what was arising was constantly arising and falling away. Something is always new. It's not static. It's not a fixed thing that's going on. So because they were already aware of that, and we talked about that a lot in the meditation part of the retreat, nobody tried to recreate anything. So the next morning when we came together, the meditation was very, very deep. But when we came together and we were speaking, it was like the night before was already gone. And everybody was just in what was happening then, because that's the truth of, you know, that is the truth of reality. There is only now. Now is now. So what happened last night is old. I might remember it, but I'm remembering it now. But now it's just a memory. And so as long as I'm not trying to hold on to anything now, then all that potential, all of that creativity that was happening the night before is also happening now. It just may look a different way. And so that's one thing we really, you know, I speak to people about, and we teach that here, is, you know, consciousness itself and being able to be completely present. It's not always going to look the same way. It's not always going to feel the same way. Your natural state is your natural state. You are always already free, and that natural state is always already who you are. You may not recognize it because you're, you know, fixated on the movement of ego. But the truth is even if you're fixated on the movement of ego, who you are is who you are. So if you just know that in your own experience and you're willing to renounce the habit to grasp, then you start to recognize that this creativity is always available and it looks different. Because if you're thinking it's going to look a certain way all the time, you'll miss it because you're only coming from ideas of what it looked like before. So it's not a case of even trying to harness it or remember it. I know some people, when they have fantastic meditations, you know, all this creativity will flow up and they just want to write their notes down and stuff. And I understand that. But really, to really honor this we space that we're talking about, it really is about trust, faith, and surrender, and not trying to hold on to anything. Because if you're trying to hold on to something, you're actually moving away from what actually already is. And that movement away is a movement of doubt or a movement of mistrust. So can you just trust that everything is always already here, always? You are always already here, always. And rest in that, and then see what emerges, because you won't know ahead of time. So I know that's could sound kind of like spiritual mumbo jumbo to some people, but you know, that's really how it works. Because if you look in your own experience, if you try to recreate anything, it's never how it was. And if you try to project into the future how you want it to be, it never works. It's always limited. It's always boring. You know, the things that really light us up are when we just let go, and you know, something, you know, something that we didn't expect happens. And then we're like, wow, that was amazing. So what I'm saying is that wow, that's amazing can be an ongoing experience. And again, not in some kind of, high, wow, you're not walking around going, wow, look at that, whatever, and getting kind of, that may happen. But normally it's just resting in something where you just have a deep gratitude and a deep appreciation for that which is animating all things. And that's the juice that helps us in relationship, because there can be miscommunications, there can be complications, there can be all sorts of stuff that happen in relationship. But if you just choose not to separate, you just choose not to impose separation, you see, then everybody can be in a dynamic we space all the time, even if you're having a disagreement. So what I described in the retreat was one expression of that, but another expression can just be two people coming together with a perceived conflict, and they both choose not to divide. And then what happens in that perceived conflict is usually far beyond what brought them together in the first place. It's not really about the conflict, but that's the catalyst that creates something.
Mm. And you've been working very specifically with certain types of conflicts or relationships, and I was going to say choosing, but it sounds more like it chose you. From what I know of the origin of your women's circle, is that
right.
You weren't really so fond of having to create that women's circle at first, or you didn't feel it was so much what you were interested in at the time, but it felt necessary, or it felt like a calling. And that's been a very long journey working with women and probably tackling aspects of them, the conflict with patriarchy, and exploring relationship of men and women. Your husband has been holding recently a men's circle, and you're bringing them together. Would you like to share a few words about that?
Yeah, I think it was about 8 years ago. I kind of had this voice in my head that I should start a women's group. And my first response was, I don't want to start a women's group. And if you ask a lot of women will say they don't really enjoy hanging out with women. They kind of rather hang out with men. And, there's other women that say, oh, they love to be with women. But I just happen to be one of those that just really felt better hanging out with men. But that's what I heard, so that's what I did, and I started this women's group. And so we, it's hard to even describe what's happened. I think the women and the men both kind of evolved differently. So it's interesting how this happened, because the women actually have been going for about 8 years, and the men maybe about 6 years. And in spiritual life, it's just easier a lot of the time that women tend to go to more retreats. They tend to go to more spiritual things. And that's partially because our culture allows that for women to do. And men, it's kind of not the thing that men do. But that's changing. It definitely is changing over time. But so when the women started coming together, I was very interested in women's history. I was interested in the movement of ego. I was interested in women's conditioning. I was interested in patriarchy. So a lot of what the women did for the first many years is we really went into what we would call women's conditioning, which I don't really like to call it that way anymore. I'll explain why in a minute. But so we would do that. So we would be more, as women, who normally women would come together in a more relational type of way, or maybe through dance, or maybe through singing, or something that would be considered more feminine. We actually came together in more like dialogue and inquiry in a way that is normally related to men. And then when the men started coming together, you would expect them to be talking more like in a philosophical way, which they did. But a lot of the trajectory for the men was for men to come together in a more relational way, to actually be more intimate together in a way that women have. It's easier for women. So the men kind of did what you would expect the women to do, and the women kind of did what you expected the men to do. And we all evolved, and then it became kind of a mix. But then when we came together about 3 years ago, so we actually did this work separately for probably 5 years. And then we decided, okay, let's bring the men and the women together and let's see what happens. And I have to say, Pete and I were a little bit nervous that day because we didn't really know what was going to happen, because there was such intimacy between each group. And we wondered, if you brought the groups together, would the intimacy still be the same, or would people hold back because the other gender was actually present? But I'll tell you what happened was, in the first meditation, the meditation field was so strong. And then that whole day, it was a one-day event. That whole day was just an explosion of actually just like pure love, pure joy, pure everything. And we spoke about everything, and there was no, there was no holding back. There was no self-consciousness. It was beautiful. And then over time, since that happened, I think that was 3 years ago now, over time, as we started to look more deeply into patriarchy, the women already had, but then we started to bring it to the men. And we started to push into male superiority, for example. And then the men became interested. And there's some of these very deep structures within us that are very hard to puncture. And so for men, it's very difficult to see male superiority. Women are able to see it more clearly because we tend to be the ones who are receiving it. And because men, it's so celebrated that the male superior position is so accepted, it's very difficult for men to see it sometimes. And but we had enough trust, we had enough common values, we had enough interest to transcend gender and to go past it, that we all ended up realizing that in order to break this patriarchal structure, which is oppressive to both men and women, in order to break this structure, we had to do it together. So women had to be able to speak about, you could say, their pain of being oppressed by the male superiority, but by not taking any separate position with the men. So there was no blame, there was no shame. The men, they had to look at them taking that position and also look at it as they are products of their culture. They're not bad men just because they were doing this. And most of them are actually fantastic, and well, all of them really. But sometimes we have this idea of superior men have a certain look or a certain feel, but actually this is something that's so prevalent in society now, that even men who are quite spiritual or quite advanced or even big supporters of women, that structure can still be in place with them. So the men we're working with are actually quite awake, and so they were interested, but they had to really be interested because they actually just couldn't see it. So we've done, we've done work together, and we continue to do work together. But the more we work together and the more interest there is to just break down whatever stuff happens to be there and rest more deeply in that which we know we already are. I have to say that the gender division is starting to fade. And let me be specific about this, because the conditioning is still there. We're still, we haven't transcended, women haven't transcended their conditioning, and men haven't completely. But what we are together in is in the true desire, interest, and curiosity to transcend patriarchy. We're together in that. So that's already a movement of transcending patriarchy. Just the fact we're interested and the fact we're interested in doing together is quite a step. So there's a long way to go in a certain way, and it's already happening in another way. And then in the third way, when we come together in this deeper dimension of ourselves, it's already beyond all this, it's already beyond gender anyway. It's already beyond patriarchy. So, but you can't bypass anything. You really can't bypass, your human condition just because you might be resting in something deeper. So you have to be interested in all of it. You have to be interested in surrendering to that which you already are more and more and more. And you also have to be interested in the fact that you might still have some habits of ego moving around in there. Um, so it's really about being available to all of it, and when you do that and you find other people are interested in doing that, then really there is no limit of what we can do and where we can go.
Sounds like a dissection, or rather, like in a fabric, if there's some knitting that needs to be redone, like realigning, redefining what's there while being the whole of the fabric at the same time. And
yeah, it's kind of like, it's an interesting thing because you're surrendering to what is, and you're surrendering to the fact that the fabric is there. You don't have to deny that you're, that there is a movement of ego with you. It's when we deny something that we move away from what is. So it's not about denying any aspect of your experience. If racist thoughts are arising, they're arising. It doesn't help to act like they're not there, which is what most people want to do, because it's like, oh, I shouldn't be having that thought. That makes me something. But if it's just an object that's arising in your consciousness and you recognize it as that, you don't have to deny it. You don't have to push it away. You don't have to try to prove that you're not having it.
Which requires a great sense of trust in a field, a great sense of being held in whatever arises and whatever emerges.
Right. Because when you trust, it's kind of a chicken and an egg thing sometimes when you think about trust. Because do you trust and then surrender occurs, or do you surrender and then you recognize trust? Or do you surrender and you recognize that there's nothing to trust because there really is no other that you need to trust? So these are all like very interesting questions also to look into. But what I think we can all say is that when we drop all this kind of attachment to insanity, really, when we drop this attachment to all these ideas that we have about ourselves and everybody else, when we just let those, we don't even have to drop them, when we just don't, we're just not so interested in them, then all of a sudden it's like the doors of perception open and there's something else there. So it really is, we're not creating anything, we're not dropping anything, we're just not denying anything. So when you don't deny what's arising within your awareness, you become aware of that which is the root, that which is the source of everything that's arising. So it seems counter to what most people think, because if you actually have something really intense in your background, or let's say that you've done something really, really horrible, if you don't deny that and you face it and you're with it, not with it as you're, embracing it, but you just aren't denying it and you don't move, then all of a sudden, and you don't make it mean something so personal about you, even though you personally take responsibility for it. When that happens, you see you're with what is, because that is what's happening. But you're not just with a particular event that's arising in your awareness. If you're with that, you also become available and you're with everything. You're with that which is animating everything. And then there's a proper context in which you're seeing your whole human experience without denying your human experience. I mean, we did a women's retreat recently. This is something that I think is just fascinating. So this was a retreat with women from the ongoing women's group. We do it once a year. It was 5 days. And this year it was that we were going into sexuality and abuse. So these were like really intense subjects, and this is just such a beautiful expression of the power of this we space, because the women were willing to speak. And that was really one of the instructions of the retreat, is just allow yourself to speak, meaning you don't have to hide anything, you don't have to be ashamed of anything, just speak. And because the topic was sexuality, women started to speak about very personal issues of when they'd been sexually abused. They'd also started to speak about different times where they had been the abuser. So we had both sides of the coin. We had We had women that were able to speak about anything, really. And as one woman spoke and the shame was released, you see, then all of a sudden they emerged. It's like the mask came off, they emerged, and then that pulled on another woman, and another woman would speak, and the mask came off. And this just continued to happen in this very beautiful flow. But what emerged out of that was not anger, was not, a polarization to the abuser, was not an attack upon oneself if they happen to have been the abuser themselves. What came out of that was the natural qualities of all human beings, which was love, empathy, love and empathy. No, when they came out of this retreat, you can't imagine some of these stories. Sometimes it was just heartbreaking, some of these stories. But what emerged was just more intimacy, more love, but not just for the women in the retreat, but for everything. So when we met with a lot of the men afterwards, there was nothing but an expression of love, because everybody could see that anything that ever happened to them in the past, anything that they had ever done, was a product of unconsciousness and cultural conditioning, really. So that we space, that wasn't a we space in the same way as I described the one in the retreat. It was a we space of just like authenticity coming through, and it occurred because people were willing to speak and to let go of the shame that had kept them down. And so, like I said, it doesn't look a particular way, but it's beautiful in all of its expressions. It really is.
What would you say? You said earlier that there are different things for, I think you used the word puncture for men and women, some or different maybe layers to look at or masks to perceive. What would you say has been most present for women, or what have you noticed that men can start looking at?
I think the thing, so you're basically saying like what was the biggest thing for women as far as when they started to see through the effects of the male superiority, for example? Something like that. I'll tell you, the thing that really stood out is the women started to understand how disrespected they were and how they allowed themselves to be disrespected. And one of the ways, this is a really, really common one, but there's a way that a lot of the time that women are just not heard and they're just not listened to. It's very, very simple. And they just, we can become used to that. We're just used to not being listened to. So a lot of times women will either speak louder, trying to be listened to, trying to be heard, or they just won't talk. And and also it's a very interesting thing with male superiority, because men are actually taught that they are superior to women. I mean, Aristotle basically spoke about, and said that women were inferior men. We basically were mutated men in some way. So we weren't complete. We were over-emotional. We needed to be kept in the house. Because of this over-emotionality, we were dangerous to ourselves, and that men needed to take care of us, and that was their job. So we look at that and we think, well, that's crazy. Who would believe that? But that was the level of consciousness at that time. And if you look at today, there's a lot, that's still going on. And there's a lot of ideas about that. And so because there's this idea that men are superior and women are inferior, coming from both men and women, the idea that men can have is that their experience or their interpretation of their experience is the correct one. Their interpretation, their experience is the reference point of what's actually true. So when a woman says, well, look, this is what I see, the man could listen to it, but he might just say, well, that's not my experience. And because it's not my experience, he doesn't say this. He doesn't say it's not my experience, so therefore it's not true. But it's kind of like, well, it's not my experience. That's kind of, there's a period at the end of that, And so I think the thing, just to kind of answer your question, I think the women really, really understood disrespected they had been, and not being heard. And I think, the subtlety of male superiority, and it puts a lot of pressure on men too, because they have to maintain something. So it's not, male superiority doesn't just hurt women, it also hurts men. But there's a subtlety if you just, the men had to really put themselves in the women's shoes and just go, what does it actually feel like to not be heard, not to be listened to? What does that feel like? Because most of them couldn't relate to it. Now, with what I'm saying, because this is also a very important part of this whole gender investigation that we've gone into, is we do look at things through a gender lens. So we see things as male and female. These are male characteristics, these are female characteristics. These are men, these are women. So really, we want to be able to understand that we're looking through a gender lens. That's what we're trained to do. But ultimately, there is no gender. There is no gender lens. So what I mean by that is there is female conditioning that might be more prevalent in a female body, and male conditioning more in a male body. But female conditioning, or the female movement of ego, is what we could call the false feminine, and the male conditioned movement of ego we could call the false masculine. But there's women that are actually manifesting the false masculine characteristics, and men actually manifesting the false female characteristics. But then we have the divine qualities also. So we have the divine feminine qualities, which are usually, labeled and tied to women, and then we have the divine male qualities that usually are men. So, for example, the divine female quality might be empathy, love, relationships. The divine male qualities might be truth, one-pointedness, strength, courage. Okay, but again, these are divine qualities that we have labeled as male, female. But they're all of this, the divine masculine, divine feminine, is all in me. It's all in you, whether I'm in a female body or a male body. The false masculine and the false feminine are all characteristics of the movement of ego that are all, they can be activated in any of us. So when we start to be able to look at this whole picture, we can see that it's not really a gender issue. It's just basically an ego issue, trying to transcend this movement of separation so that we can manifest all these beautiful divine qualities and not limit anybody because of the gender that they're in. But in order to understand all of that, you can understand it, and it can be very, very easy to bypass where we're at as human beings right now. And the truth is we're looking through a gender lens. So we have to be able to hold kind of multiple perspectives. We hold the perspective of divine masculine, divine feminine, false masculine, false feminine, can be in any human being. And we have to realize that there's a gender lens that we're looking through. So we have to hold both perspectives and always reach for the highest one. But we don't want to bypass where we are right now as human beings either.
Mm.
So it takes some effort, because we learn how much we relate to life from a gender lens to ourselves and other people.
Would you say that once that big recognition part, or acknowledgement part and healing part is done, say with the Journey with Women's Circle, that there is no need anymore at that point then for gender-based circles?
That's an interesting question. And that question, I've had this question before, and that question comes from the idea that if women are coming together or men are coming together separately, that is a step along the way to transcend that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there's a joy in coming together with just women, and there's a joy in coming together with just men. So to meet as separate circles is not because we're trying to get somewhere else. It's the joy of being together. And there is a different quality when women are together. There's just something different about it. And there's different when men are together. And there's a different when you come together as men and women, and they're all beautiful. So we don't want to limit ourselves by just saying, oh, well, let's forget this because we're beyond it, and then we'll go up here.
Right.
But how we relate to each other and where we go, because I don't know where we can go together as a group of women, and I don't know where the men can go together. And sometimes I wish I was a man so I could know what it would be like to be a man to go to. So I don't know, and I don't know where we can go. And this is the beauty of what we were talking about earlier, because it's constantly being revealed. It's constantly being revealed, and none of us know. We don't, and that's the beauty. It's like it's so much joy in not knowing. If you think about, if you knew everything, the mystery is missing, and it's that mystery that actually enlivens everything. It's the mystery of consciousness itself, that just kind of blows all your ideas consistently, even if something is really fantastic. And I'll tell you, after this retreat, my biggest challenge was to just be able to bear the enormity of how good it was, and not try to limit it by any way. It's like, oh God, I'm just so overwhelmed, and then start to think about how overwhelmed I am. It was just really, the challenge is just like to hang out there in overwhelmedness, and see what would happen next, instead of going, oh God, that's just too much. Of course I needed to sleep. I was really tired afterwards, but the impulse to want to make something smaller comes because we have an idea that I can't take any more than this. But that we don't know how much we can take. We don't know how blown open we can be until we're willing to, to not resist. And that's the process, because we all resist in some way. I mean, we're always, we're always resisting. And even if we think something's fantastic, see, we have no idea if that's the whole show or if we're just seeing like a little tiny piece of it.
Mm. That's very refreshing to hear, because what is heard most of the time about the after retreat emotions and feelings is more already the resistance and the resistance to resistance, kind of, oh, but how am I going to be in the daily life now when
right
among other people, and how does that, would you like to say some words about that? Because you're creating something very special, very unique, and all of this can thrive in a container. And people who leave that context and they've had an amazing experience and they're overwhelmed and they enjoy.
Right.
And how does that translate? Yeah, how does that come into the mainstream, or does it clash? And how to find the way of no separation there too, that it's not a separation of, now there's this life that is potentially being lived, and then there's the rest of the world.
Yeah, and this is a common question. It actually came up last night from somebody again. You always have to go back to the deepest spiritual understanding that you have. And so if you know in your own experience that the really separation is an illusion, you've either experienced that maybe in a retreat setting, maybe out in nature, where everything just disappears and you understand something. You need to always go back to that deepest understanding, because if you know that in your own experience, that separation is an illusion, that means it's always an illusion. Okay? So separation, our definition of ego, for example, is the insistence that separation is real and limitation is real. So if you've actually seen, even if it's been a glimpse, that you know that's not true, even though 99% of your life you feel like that's what you're living in, but you know something else, then you need to start trying to live from your deepest understanding. So for example, everyone's always worried about all those other egos out there. They're going to try to come and get them, right? Or attack them or do something to them. And it's a fair enough question, because that is what's happening a lot of the time. We live in a society where people are walking around where they think they're separate, isolated, and alone, and the other guy thinks they're separated, isolated, and alone. They're conditioned and they don't know it. They're conditioned and they don't know it. They think they're right. They think they're right. And everybody's bouncing off of each other. And nobody's really together. And this is the challenge. How can you live this, right? Because we live in a world where we're bouncing off of each other. But the one thing I always tell people is The deepest dimension of me is the deepest dimension of everybody. And if I decide not to impose separation myself, because I can only change myself. So we always say the finger's always pointed here. If I don't take a position of separation and I'm out in the world and I meet somebody else, and let's say they come at me with some kind of egoic response, and let's just say that I don't personalize that. I don't receive it as if it's a personal attack. I understand it didn't feel well. I'm not denying my own experience, but I just don't react with the same polarized position. So basically what happens is the ego game is like this. And then all of a sudden somebody says, I'm not going to play. And then the ego comes out and it's like, whoo-hoo, where did you go? Something's different here. What's going on? And there's a moment that insistence of ego in this person is a little bit confused or displaced. And in that second, something different can happen. And you can't underestimate the difference. That person may all of a sudden just stop and go, oh. Or they may continue, and you have to say, look, I really don't want to continue with this conversation, so I'm going to go. I wish you all the best. And then you go. But you see, even that is planting a seed. And that person may walk away and go, wow, what just happened there? Because, they didn't actually yell at me when I yelled at them. So the finger is always pointed here. It's everybody wants to have the other ego, the other people change, and then they can change. But what we say, no, you change. You stop playing the game. And if enough people stop playing the game, then enough people are going to notice, wow, there's something different going on here. And a lot of people can relate to that they're maybe just drawn to somebody. They may not even know this person, but all of a sudden they just feel like, gosh, I really like being with them, or that was really a pleasant conversation with the woman in the bank or whatever. So what's going on there? Maybe that person just isn't giving you that same reaction. And then what happens? You're pulled to it, because the deepest spiritual truth is consciousness is pulled toward itself. It wants to meet itself in the other. That's really what's going on. And then we impose this separation, so then there's a block. So the daily life is life. It doesn't matter. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're living on the side of a mountain in Portugal or if you're in a city. You've chosen where you're living. You've chosen the situation that you're in. So take responsibility for the fact that you chose it. You're not victimized by your circumstances. And then do the work to rest in a deeper dimension of yourself so you can invite other people to do the same. Don't wait for the other people to invite you. You invite them by being who you are. And I'll tell you, most people have a very, very deep craving. They just want to be themselves. And they don't even know what that is, but they know it. So there's something in them that's already saying, I want to be myself. And people are tired of, having a particular identity that they constantly have to prove to themselves and prove to everybody else. And that's what ego is. I have an identity. I have to prove it to you. I have to prove it to myself. It's a constant work. And then you just become the object of, I need you in order to reflect back to me that my self-image is okay. But what if I just decide I don't want to have a self-image. I just want to be myself. And then I'm not going to use you. I'm not going to use anybody to tell me who I am, because who I am is not separate from anybody. So does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you. That is very...
And then you see life becomes thrilling. It becomes you can live your life, and then you look at things that are challenging, and you can say, okay, how can I respond to this differently? I just don't want to do the same thing I do all the time, because I know where that's going to lead. I just don't want to do that anymore. So we just have to try something new, and we have to learn. And that's why what we do here at the project is, it's not, the meditation is the primary practice, but really understanding this movement of ego, it's so important, and it's the thing that a lot of people want to avoid. A lot of people can say they have an ego, but not many people are that interested in letting go of it. Or you actually find out how interested you are in it, in letting go of it, when it's actually challenged. Like if you're taking a victimized position and you have a moment that you can choose not to be a victim, do you choose not to be a victim, or do you choose to continue with the victimization because that gets you, gets you something?
Do you have some specific techniques or very pragmatic ways to stop yourself or catch yourself when that starts happening?
Well, one way, obviously, if you do a regular meditation practice, everything starts slowing down, so you see more. But one way you can recognize this, movement, this movement of ego, this habit. Let's call it a habit, because it's not a boogeyman that's inside of you. It's not a solid structure that you have to get over. It's just a thought that arises that you attach to because that's the habit, and then you think it's me. And when that happens, what normally people feel is they feel a contraction. You physically will feel contracted. And so if you feel a contraction, you just stop for a moment and go, what's going on here? And usually there's fear, right? It's usually fear. So like if you think about something you really want to do, there's a creative idea that sparks. And usually right behind that creative idea that sparks is a thought that says, oh, no. You shouldn't do that. That's not a good idea, or there's fear that arises. So when you feel that creative spark, it's usually like an expansion, right? And then the fear arises and it feels like a contraction. So just recognize that in your own experience and realize that the expansion is your true self, and the contraction is the limitation and the separation that's being imposed in that moment if you go with that contraction. Okay, so just the experience of contraction doesn't mean that you're acting out of ego. It just means that there's a contraction. But in that moment, notice it. It's a very practical thing to do. You can just notice it. Like if you're walking up to someone and you're nervous, right? And then you start contracting, then what happens? You usually put your attention on, oh, I'm so nervous, and then what happens? You get more nervous, right? Mm-hmm. And then you come up to the person, you can't hardly speak, and then you walk away and you go, God, I'm so stupid, I couldn't hardly speak. So you've just proven, it's like the ego has just reinforced
the story of its own.
Yeah, but what if you were really nervous, and there's nothing wrong, so what? You're nervous, something's arising, you're afraid, there's fear, all this stuff is arising, but you recognize it as just something that's arising in your awareness, and you just don't make it important. So right now, for example, you have no idea what my internal experience is, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't know what yours is, but, I could say right now my internal experience is one of, I'm very happy and excited to speak with you, but I could say that I'm a little bit nervous. There's nervousness arising, There's the question arising, am I making any sense? Is this going to be any good? So all of that's arising, but it's like if I put my attention on that, then I wouldn't probably be able to speak or get excited about what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. So it's really about, where do you want to put your attention? Do you want to put it on the contraction, which is the big no? Or do you want to put it on the expansion, which is the big yes? And I guarantee you can't put your attention on both at the same time.
That's probably that explosion of joy like you had at the retreat, when all in a group are in that expansion at the same time.
Right. And in that expansion, see, lots of people were having lots of thoughts, but they didn't make them important because they were more interested in the expansion than they were in the contraction. Mm. So you didn't have to, if they were afraid of the thoughts, they would be busy pushing the thoughts away. But you see, they're just objects that are arising within the expansion. And so you don't have to contract around them.
So they're not the pollution in the room.
No, not at all. Because if you think about it, and this is where, again, you have to go back to the deepest spiritual truth. Everything that's arising in this manifest world is coming out of the same source, right? I mean, and maybe you don't know, I know you know this, but maybe some people listening don't know that in their own experience, so you have to find out for yourself. But for me, I know that that's the truth, that everything that I perceive in this manifest world is arising out of the same source of the unmanifest. And so that means that ego is also a manifestation or a modification of consciousness. You know, pain is a modification of consciousness. Suffering is a modification of consciousness. You know, so it's not just the good stuff is consciousness. If everything is a modification of consciousness, that means everything. So then you might see, wow, it's like pain. Is pain something I need to avoid? If pain is a modification of consciousness, which is, in the essence of consciousness is love, if I don't avoid this pain, what could happen? And what will happen if you don't avoid pain is it will open your heart, and you'll not only be able to experience the love of whoever might have caused the pain, but you'll experience something far beyond that. And so the pain is actually a driver to try to wake you up to that which is manifesting everything. So, and again, some people say, oh yeah, everything is, all this horrible stuff that happens, it's a huge, beautiful opportunity for me to evolve. And they turn it into some kind of romantic thing. Pain is pain. It's challenging. Suffering is suffering. It's challenging. It doesn't always feel good, but if you look below the feeling, it doesn't mean you deny the feeling, but if you just look a little bit below and you understand what's driving it, then all of a sudden something starts to happen. But if you try to push away the pain and you push away the suffering, you're denying that which is trying to wake you up. Mm. And so, if you want to wake up and if you want to continue being awake, you want to receive that which is being given.
I'm taking all that in, and I'm realizing that our time is coming to an end.
Yeah.
And there's so much bubbling up right in this moment. But
we always have this problem, don't we, Anne? Because when we get together and we talk, we're always on the phone for like 2 hours or something, 2.5 hours, because there's always more. Like, we get so excited.
Talking and laughing. I have to say that it's really an experience that is very refreshing in the sense that I feel the depth is proportional to the joy, or vice versa. It's just earlier in my life I've seen a dichotomy somewhere up there, and I tend to tip into the seriousness of all matters and to realize there is a true joy and true lightness within depth that has been really beautiful to experience with you.
Yeah, well, great. I really enjoy speaking with you too.
And I invite all our listeners to have a look at your website. That Pete and you are, it's your common project. It's awakenedlifeproject.org. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
There's all the information there about, there's so much happening. So I don't know if I can describe it all, but there is a virtual retreat in November that will happen. Is that right? And,
yeah.
There's also a weekly webinar.
No, it's the first Wednesday of every month. I do a free webinar, which lasts for an hour and a half. So I give a little talk usually, and then people just ask questions.
Yeah, so I experienced one. It was about happiness and freedom. I think it was really eye-opening. So I recommend that webinar to all our listeners. Thank you so much, Cynthia. Is there anything you would like to add?
No, I just really encourage people. We are all having this impulse to create, this impulse to come together is arising in all of us, quite often, every day, many, many times. And I just encourage people to really follow that impulse within them to reach for something higher than what they already experiencing. Just follow that impulse. And even if the voice comes in the, in the background that tells you, no, you can't do it, it's not possible for you. Just don't listen to the voice. Just put your attention on the impulse and follow that, and you will find your way. I guarantee it. And there's so much out there that's happening, and people are coming together in the most beautiful way. So if you follow that impulse of the big yes, you can't really go wrong.
Beautiful. And there is also the group discussion that will give an idea for everyone who wants to get a feel of what it is to be in a group together with Cynthia. So that is another video on this website for you. So thank you again, Cynthia.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation.
See you soon.
Okay,
Bye.
ciao.
Thank you for joining us on this collective journey. To sample more speakers from the Global WeSpace Summit, tune into www.thewespacesummit.com. Here you will find over 150 trailblazing pioneers and WeSpace experts, as well as 26 catalysts convening these conversations at the next edge of collective consciousness and culture.